Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Stephen Kowalski about what and why experimentation and iteration are part of business success. Don't know the difference between them? Stay tuned. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Madelyn Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about unlocking the resilient leader in you. When a person begins cooking for the first time, they try to find easy recipes that they can replicate. After a while, they feel confident enough to adjust the original recipe, maybe because they want to try a bit more of one ingredient, or maybe because they find they are missing an ingredient and have to find a substitute. That's iteration. Sometimes chosen, sometimes required. After some time, they begin to feel quite confident, and they no longer depend on a recipe. They begin creating their own recipes. Confronted with meal preparation, they discover that lovely piece of meat they bought on sale won't fit into any of their recipes. So maybe they have to look on YouTube, but they can't find something about it. Well, with or without details, the cook begins that wonderful process called experimentation. It requires some knowledge, recipes, cooking techniques, and some willingness to take a risk. My husband is retired, and for the last 5 years or so, he cooks dinner on Tuesday and Friday nights. He has gone through the process I just described exactly. His only head start was that he had a little cookbook of recipes he liked and were easy. In business, we're not trying to cook dinner. Oh, okay, maybe if you're in the food business. We're trying to provide product or service to our customers. So how do we look at iteration and experimentation? Because there will be times when we don't have the exact right ingredients, or we find ourselves in a completely new environment and experimentation is called for. To answer these questions, my guest will join us right after this message from our sponsor. Since the 1800s, Smith Island cakes have been a symbol of family, faith, and community. In 2009, the Smith Island Baking Company was created as the custodian of this treasure, shipping hundreds of thousands of cakes made from scratch, packed with care, and delivered to celebrations of all sizes and shapes, far and wide. Today, people just like you celebrate important occasions with a cake. When is your next birthday? This is Madelyn Blair, and you're listening to Unlocked, where we're talking about experimentation and iteration. We're going to address the question of how do we look at these with someone who has been on the show before. So I know you're going to find this fun as well as very informative. He is Dr. Stephen Kowalski, an organization development consultant, speaker, executive coach, and the author of Creative Together, Sparking Innovation in the New World of Work. He has more than 25 years' experience facilitating the creativity of scientists, engineers, business leaders, and professionals to deliver bold solutions that are scalable and sustainable through his creative license consulting services. He is the author of over 100 workplace learning programs, and you can find him at stephenkowalski.com. And here he is. Stephen, welcome back to Unlocked.
Thanks so much, Madelyn. It's great to be here with you again.
Oh, thank you. You know, as I said, Stephen is not a stranger to Unlocked, and I'm so happy to have you back. I really am. There are so many things that I have in my mind, the questions that I want to ask you, but I want to actually touch back on what you talked about in our other show. You talked about creativity is a potential.
Yes.
How did you move from that amazing insight to experimentation and iteration?
Well, the foundation of the first book I've written, Creative Together, really lays out a new story about what creativity is and how we can activate it in our lives, in our work, and then how we can get creative together more effectively. So, creativity has always been a passion of mine, and it was kind of the driving force to help us understand that most of us see creativity as an ability that's spread across the population in what you might think of as a normal distribution, a normal curve. And so that would mean that some people are creative, uh, highly creative. Some people are not, don't think of themselves as creative at all. And most of us fall kind of in that middle. We think, oh, I'm creative sometimes, but not as creative as Susie, or not as creative as my child, or Steve Jobs, or somebody like that. So um, that's the old story of what creativity is as an ability. So what I discovered in my work all these years and through my dissertation study is that actually we've been thinking about it all wrong. Creativity is a potential, which means that it's there when we need it, and it doesn't show up when we don't need it. If the status quo is great, if the status quo is working, then our creativity just kind of hangs back. There's no reason to expend that extra effort to change something, to invent something, to disrupt, to adapt. And those are some of the uses of our creativity. So in this exploration of creativity, then now that we realize, hey, we're all creative, we don't have to compare ourselves to each other. It's a potential. It's not an ability. I've got that potential. Okay, how do I implement it? And that's where experimentation and iteration come in. So I have this creativity, and then I've got to get it out in the world. And so many times we think we got to get it perfect. Experimentation and iteration are answers to that age-old problem.
Oh, good. So tell us about them from your perspective. How are they the same? How are they different?
Sure. Well, both of them, like you shared in the example you shared about recipes and cooking, both of them are great tools for when we're not exactly sure how to go about something, when we're stepping across the threshold into the unknown, when we're trying something new, when we want to learn. These are methods of trying something out and learning. And so that they share that. When I think about experimentation, I think about wanting to understand something that will help inform my decision making, help inform investments I might make, strategic investments. We're talking about a business, um, and and the experiment itself actually yields learning. That's its
Mm.
primary purpose. Iteration, I think, I think of more like almost as a process of building something, of developing something. So, say I've done a bunch of experiments and I've understood that my idea is desired, it's feasible, and it's viable in the ecosystem with my customers and in markets and ecosystems, right? So I've done some experiments and I figured out, hey, this idea actually is, let's start investing in it, right? I might start to build a prototype of a service or a product, and that prototype, building that prototype in iterations is a much smarter way to go than trying to the full, like the expensive polished version right off the bat, which most of us can't do. And frankly, it's a waste of resources and a waste of a lot of time trying to get it right the first time. So between experimentation and iteration, they're both great ways to step into something, learn, adapt, adjust, and maybe even realize that our idea isn't isn't great, or it isn't going to be received or viable in the ecosystem.
As you're describing that, the the penultimate to me, the penultimate example came to mind, the iPhone. Now,
Yes,
it was an incredible experiment on Steve Jobs and Apple's part because
yes.
it was really new. But oh my goodness, have you ever looked at an old iPhone and compared it to what has become of it?
It's amazing and sometimes we can't even see the iterations down the road, right? We can only see the ones in front of our face. And the D school at Stanford is famous for design thinking, which is in a way a process of building something in iterative cycles, right? So we're accustomed. That's why I say that experimentation feels like learning about whether it's going to work or not, and whether people want it, and so forth. And iteration is my way of building it so that I'm building it in the smartest way possible.
I've already noted that experimenting yields knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Oh, okay. And iteration gives you a chance to, I'll use that fancy word, reifies that knowledge, makes it real.
And it helps us build and
Yeah.
test along the way. I mean, these are uh, both great tools for testing
Yeah.
and evaluating what comes back, evaluating feedback, evaluating input. Again, if I go to the iPhone, uh, you know, when groups who are doing design thinking might actually want to prototype a video of something like a learning video or something for a service or a tool that they're bringing forward. Oftentimes, they'll actually create a giant iPhone out of cardboard with a hole where the screen would be, and they'll stand in front of that and actually deliver their message, and people in the audience can react and decide, oh, here's where I would swipe you off, or here's where I would like you.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh, clever. I've never seen that example. Wow. Nice. Are, are there other examples that come to mind? Maybe some that you've worked with companies even.
yeah, maybe one of my recent projects working on designing and building and delivering a leadership development program for a very specific audience. This group of senior leaders, uh, I would say many of them thought they didn't need to learn anything. They reached the pinnacle of their success, PhD, MDs, and um, they didn't really want an upskilling program, or a program that somehow made it feel like there was something missing,
Yeah.
right? So how are we going to bring a development program to a group of folks who are super busy, incredibly important in the value chain, and who might think they know everything they need to know, right? So think about experimentation and iteration. This was the way we went about it. So we decided our first iteration was going to be about peer-to-peer learning. We weren't going to try to roll out a big program and design it and think in advance of all the things that they would want to learn and then give it to them. We wanted to put them in the driver's seat. And so our first iteration was peer to peer. And our goal was to spark a learning environment or a learning ethos between them. And so that was our iteration. We said, we're going to do this, and then we're going to learn.
I have to interject. I think that is just brilliant because what you basically said to them was, well, you are so good. Let you teach each other.
Yeah. You know what you want to learn.
Yes, as well.
That's actually you know what you want to learn, and they did. It was fantastic. So what we did inside of that iteration was we did a bunch of experiments. We experimented with different formats. We experimented with different content. We experimented with different deliveries, like do we bring everybody together? These are people who are spread around the world in different locations. Do we do it regionally? So we experimented inside of this first iteration, and we learned a lot. And when we heard what folks were interested in, and those needs could be fulfilled from within the company, we brought in folks who could deliver that content, and the leaders themselves hosted the sessions. In our next iteration, we realized that we needed to start to have some kind of curriculum that was a little bit more standardized. But think about all that we had learned from our experiments and from our iteration that helped bring that second iteration to life.
Oh, how fortunate you were to have that opportunity, though, to be able to have all that iteration going on, and to really look at it from, okay, let's look at it from this angle. Now let's try this. Ah,
Mm-hmm.
wonderful. What an example. Are you still doing that, or have they finished their work? Do they?
They're still going. They're still going strong. They're still going strong, and I have a lot of confidence in this peer-to-peer approach where learning comes from the learners themselves. I think, I'll get off my soapbox in a minute, but I think, a lot of why learning and development functions suffer a credibility gap or are still years and decades later trying to show their credibility or show their value is because too often the learning is designed by somebody else and it's about something that may or may not be relevant to the learners.
Correct.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a story that Ed Hoffman tells of NASA. How do you get these senior scientists together in a meaningful way so that they learn? And they ended up that they were simply telling each other about their projects. And in the telling of those stories, there was then, of course, conversation. And he said it was incredibly successful because, like you, it was really peer-to-peer learning.
Yeah, yeah. So that maybe helps illustrate how intertwining these can be. I mean,
Yeah.
on some meta level, Madelyn, we could treat almost everything we do as an experiment.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that might help relieve the pressure to be perfect or to get it right the first time. There are some challenges, and I know we want to talk about some of the challenges in organizations to approaching work in this way. But I just wanted to say it's also a life choice.
Yes. You're either a lifelong learner or you're not. I oftentimes I work with managers and just remind them that they have, they're surrounded by things they can learn from.
Yes.
And once they catch it, I don't have to work with them anymore because they become their own teacher just by observing more carefully what's happening around them.
Yes. And another thing about experimentation that might be worthwhile pointing out is that there's space to fail. In an experimental mindset, there's space to fail. In fact, sometimes you might want to design an experiment to try to force failure and see what happens, right? Not that many companies, not that many people are courageous enough. And, I might suggest people being super clear about what they're trying to do so that someone doesn't think that they're aiming for failure. But if an experiment can show us the weakness of an idea or an approach, if it might show us where we would fail, that's critically important. Again, if you go back to viability, desirability, and feasibility.
Yep. I love that last point, that there is a mindset about experimentation, that it can fail.
There's space to fail. Space to succeed. There's space to fail. There's space for all kinds of responses. The trick is to draw out the learning and use that to progress our shared purpose.
And when you go in with the idea that one of the objectives is to learn something, then something coming out not the way you wanted it to or expected it to is now just falls into this category called learning.
Yes.
Okay. All right. How does a business, an organization, a community even, how do they decide we need to do some experimentation?
Anytime there's something new, anytime we're after new value, I think experimentation and iteration are great tools. in our toolbox. So I would say, very first, again, leaving behind the idea that I could live my life in a way that's guided by a mindset of experimentation. If I'm wanting to progress something, if I'm wanting to develop a service, if I'm wanting to design a product, if I'm wanting to change some social policies, some policy, or any of these kind of approaches, I might use experimentation and iteration um, as a tool to step into something and help avoid the swamp, in Creative Together, I talk a lot about the swamps we find ourselves in when we cross the threshold into the unknown, right? And whenever we're creating, we are crossing the threshold into the unknown. And taking that experimental mindset, taking that experimental approach, iterating, these are ways to uh, find myself on more firm ground as I
Mm-hmm.
make my way through the challenges, the obstacles, the constraints that are going to show up.
Mm-hmm. So I want a couple of examples to really ground my thinking. Let's say that you're a company where a competitor just came up with a product that is so much better than yours. I assume that would be a real signal. You better start experimenting.
Yeah, it could be with different, maybe I'm going to, again, we're going to assume that our creativity is there with us.
Okay, I will.
And we're going to assume that we're in touch with it, we're using it consciously, we're we're rebounding with resilience, we're adapting and pivoting with agility, we're inventing new solutions, and we're disrupting. So, if I was working with a client who found themselves in this situation, part of the question would be, okay, what do we want to experiment with? Do we want to experiment with how to bring our product into new spaces or somehow enhance features of our own product to make it more attractive? Do we want to, what a radical idea to actually partner with a competitor. We want to experiment. We want to experiment with different kinds of partnership models. So there's so many ways, so many places that one could experiment in this kind of situation.
Okay, now I'm going to challenge myself. What is it that would stimulate a community to say they want to experiment? Because that's a really tough one, mainly because how do you tell people that you don't necessarily even know that you're experimenting? Have you encountered anything like this?
Well, maybe we get a little bit more specific about a type of community. What are we talking
All
about?
right.
Like a
Let's say it's a city, a small city. Let's talk about just 100,000 uh, population of this city. What
well,
is
yeah. I live in Jacksonville, Florida, and Jacksonville has now a sustainability office, and because it's a town on the Atlantic with marshes and rivers systems and so forth that are really prone to flooding and all kinds of challenges that a city might face, especially if ocean levels continue to rise and storms continue to get more violent and destructive, right? So they have a sustainability office, and they have designed an enormous array of experiments in different communities to try different things. In this community that might be susceptible to fire, they're trying 5 or 6 experiments. In this community that's lower lying and might be susceptible to flooding, they're trying multiple experiments. And they've laid these experiments out in a sustainability report, which guides their actions for years to come as they learn how to most effectively deal with changes that might come. So I think that's a great example. I'm so inspired by their vision and their forward thinking to do that. Maybe that's a good example of how a community might experiment.
I think it's a perfect example. It's because it's very real.
Yes.
Yeah, I know there have been many visits to Holland because of the fact that they have a very similar problem there.
Yes.
It's worked
Yes. We've
for
been working on it
centuries.
for a long time.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, now I really have a sense in my mind that, all right, I understand what you mean now by experimentation and by iteration. I often call it incrementalism. to me, when you change things, it's got to be incremental because although that's not quite the same as an iteration, I'm thinking to me, it was incremental that you wanted to build changes in so that people adjusted. The system could adjust. And then you made a slight change and then it would adjust again so that there was not any total disruption as you experimented on a particular path. But that's not quite the same as what you talk about in terms of iteration, I think.
When I think about iteration, I think about prototypes in the classic design school way sense, right? Design thinking sense,
Okay.
right? If I'm going to build um, a new shopping cart, or if I'm going to build a flood control, mechanism, or if I'm going to build whatever I'm going to build a service, I start with something small, and I learn from that.
Okay.
Right? I engage customers, I engage the ecosystem in it, and I watch what happens. And then the next iteration, I incorporate all that feedback into something that involves usually more investment, right? So instead of aiming for the final finished product and assuming I know everything that I need to know, I'm being judicious with my investment resources.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to start this in a small way. I'm going to engage people. I'm going to get feedback. I'm going to engage the markets. I'm going to engage customers and get feedback. And then the next time I bring it out, this classic software development also, where with agility, you bring components in and build something through a process of iteration.
Years ago, I was working with a client and we were building an entire, I would call it knowledge management information system. And they wanted it in one big fell swoop. Mm-hmm. He said, no, that won't work. Yes. We will do this piece and then we'll figure out how, and then we'll put this piece on. And fortunately, they understood and we got them through it. And that I was so pleased. I'll never forget this one meeting I had with the president of the company. And she looked at me and she said, you saved us because we put it in the way that made sense and that it succeeded. Yeah. Okay. I have got it now. I understand. What you're saying is very much about always learning, whether it's from the experiment or from the iteration, you're always bringing in new knowledge.
Always learning. And this runs so contrary to a lot of what's going on in organizations today. For example, my experience in most companies, my experience being an employee, my experience working in companies, the pressure to perform and the proving mindset. Back in the 60s, it was ed psych, educational psychology, who first articulated what now Carol Dweck and others call the growth mindset, right? Back then it was called learning orientation.
Yeah.
And it was set against the proving orientation. And I would say from my experience, the proving orientation is alive and well and not going anywhere in most organizations today. And in a way, it's unfortunate because in a proving mindset, I'm always looking for how to show my value, get credit, not make a mistake, not get caught up in something, right? So I'm avoiding all of that juicy stuff that in a mindset of experimentation, of learning, of growth, I'm actually leveraging.
So tell me, what this begs in my mind is, what kind of leader do you need to be, develop, find to head up this kind of work?
Wow, what kind of leader? I would say open.
Open, for sure.
Open is critical. I think the kind of leader who's able to build shared purpose. Because one of the things that's critical for a culture of experimentation and iteration to flourish is that there is a sense of meaningful shared purpose. And when there's meaningful shared purpose, I find it's easier to trust my colleagues that if they're going to experiment with something or try something out or use our shared resources towards some end, and I'm not there, I'm not the decision maker, I'm not, you know, I'm giving them autonomy and some degrees of freedom, right? Uh, that trust is so much stronger if we have shared purpose. So I would say the first thing for a leader to think about if they want to become or they want to think about how they already are and could become more effective as a leader who fosters experimentation and iteration, shared purpose.
Shared purpose. Hmm. I just think of some of the managers that I've worked with, both when I was in the companies and when I was outside helping them. And it's very hard if the organization has a culture of territorialism.
Yes. And, I think all of us should realize that, as I think it was one of the Kelly brothers who helped found the design school and wrote a great book, Creative Confidence. It sits sort of beside mine, Creative Together. Uh, One of them, I think it was Tom, who said, "Our ice cube is melting." If you think about strategy, if you think about market share, if you think about these kinds of things, just imagine that's an ice cube that's melting. All right, and how fast is it melting? How slow is it melting? What else is melting around it? How is that ice cube melting going to affect other parts of the business? Right? I mean, this is a leader needs to think about all of these things, and in order to understand how to keep our ice cube alive or frozen as much as possible, or to start to think about different value streams, different strategies, right? Experimentation and iteration are critical for that too.
Mm. You also talk about collaborating, excuse me, across functional boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make this happen?
Yeah, well, I was involved in an effort to help design our work and career flexibility program. And when we were working on this, we realized that it wasn't just the HR department that owned or impacted culture. There was our facilities, site services, as we called it. There was our IT department, who held many of the collaborative tools that we use, site services, facilities, the whole feeling of the campus and the design of the campus, the feeling of the campus, the design of the insides of the buildings and how people float, HR with the employee value proposition. Actually, what we realized was that the employee value proposition is owned by all three of these groups, as well as our corporate communications group. But these four groups had never collaborated together on a project like this, right? Where no one owned it. We all had a stake in it, and so it was an experiment even to try to collaborate on something like our working flexibly philosophy and approach. So we learned a lot. We brought out our the output, the products of our efforts, our philosophy, guidelines for HR, guidelines for employees. We brought out all the stuff, the artifacts that helped to support it in iterative phases. But working together across boundaries, it was an experiment in and of itself. And I think many companies are starting to realize that working across the functional boundaries in a value chain is incredibly important, and we often work in silos. So, experimenting like in this situation, I think starts with finding a shared outcome.
It actually reminds me very much of what you said about the leader. The leader has to be aware of all of the pieces, uh, starting with the meaningful shared purpose. Uh, and I mean, by bringing those different groups together, they begin to get the perspective that a leader also has or should have.
Yes. And start. I think, back to territorialism. It's difficult if say amongst these four groups, one of the leaders has sort of a more territorial bent, or maybe another one is seeking credit. They're steeped in this proving mindset and they're seeking credit for some things, and maybe the output of a group who was working together might erode something in one of the groups for the benefit of all, right? So, this give and take, this generous exchange, this standing together,
Yeah.
is really critical, when we're working across functional boundaries, because we have to be working towards a higher principle or towards a higher outcome than any one group's outcome alone.
Okay. I want to shift us slightly. What are the challenges when a company really can't lead either experimentation or iteration? Maybe they just simply don't even comprehend the need. What have you seen happen?
Burnout.
Burnout.
Burnout is a big one. People leaving, losing sight of why they were there to begin with. Bureaucracy, a retreat to bureaucracy, what is it called? Administrivia.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these can be the consequences of losing sight of the fact that actually everything we do is an iteration. I mean, if you raise up a little bit and you think from a higher level, no leader's going to be in their position for eternity. I don't know what the statistic is about how frequently people are changing their jobs at this point. But right, I'm in a position in a company delivering value, contributing for a period of time, whatever that time is, right? And there's been a bunch of stuff that's happened before I got there, and there'll be a bunch of stuff that happens after I'm gone or after I move to a different position, right? And so in a way, my time in a role is an iteration. And I have an opportunity to think, when I think about it that way, I think, like, what's the legacy I want to leave? What good do I want to do? I remember someone telling me that this may or may not be completely factually true. I'm just going to remember it the way I want.
Okay.
Maybe we'll hear from one of the listeners. It was told that the mayor of Dubrovnik in Croatia has that position for only 6 months, maybe 8 months, or the way it was told to me, it was under a year, right? So we can't get crystallized into one approach of doing something, and there's a mindset of like, this is in a flow. I'm here in a flow. I'm here to do what I can, and that leads the folks, from what I understood, to really think about what is it that they want to contribute to the ecosystem of the city and the surrounding areas. What's going to be their legacy? What's going to be their gift, the thing that they want to focus on? So, we in a way, our time here is an iteration.
Is an iteration. This reminds me of one of my guests. Her name is Melba Holiday, and she talked about learning from herd animals, namely horses, how they lead themselves. Coming back to this Dubrovnik mayor, being there for just a short period of time. In a herd, there are 4 leaders, one in the front, one in the back. They each have their roles, and 2 on the sides. And all the ones that 2 on the sides do is look around on their side to see for threats or opportunities, and they report. But the key was that the leadership is a role and not a rank.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you're not there for permanent. That's just for the moment. So maybe that city has figured it out, that You just come in and these are the things that you do to move us to the next stage. It's another way to look at it.
Well, it is definitely. And in Creative Together, there's a whole section where I talk about, uh, or I surmise that leadership may also be a potential and not an ability.
Yes,
And,
yes.
and what that means is that it rises up in response to the circumstances. And it can rise up in response to the circumstances in anyone. We've created this artificial structure called a hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
that that may not take into account the fact that leadership is really a potential. And what would happen if we loosened it up a little bit and let it run free like those horses?
Oh, wow. I'm so excited about this. Leadership is a potential. That is so true because there are times when the least likely person becomes the leader,
Yes.
sometimes just because they're calm.
Yes. That's why I'm not a big fan of the 9 box that's often used to peg people in a group or a department to say who has leadership potential. And there are these 9 boxes, and you want your folks in the upper right corner, right, to be those stars, and the ones with runway for right. And it's based on a set of criteria
Yeah.
that may actually not be. Maybe that's an ice cube that's melting.
Maybe that's an ice cube that's melting. Well, I keep thinking, well, what if the environment is different? And this person is completely counter to what the environment is calling for.
Yeah.
Ah, well, all right. I'm going to change our conversation a little bit more.
Mhm.
Let's say that I'm a young person. I'm just starting out on my career, and I have a boss who just doesn't understand the value of experimentation, what it means. What can they do to prepare themselves, to guard themselves, to protect themselves? What can they do?
My first thought is design great experiments, right? Because experiment. It's not just like this loosey goosey thing. I mean, think about a scientist at the research bench, right? Those experiments are designed. There's a hypothesis.
Yeah.
There's a methodology.
Mhm.
There's a time frame. There's a kill or go no go, they often say. There's all kinds of rigor around experimentation, right? So if I have a boss or a manager who's not convinced about this, the best thing I can do is design some darn good rigorous experiments. And I might start with small ones. i
Yeah.
remember i remember hearing, I think it was Intuit, had a policy of 30-day experiments.
Yeah.
In 30 days, you decide whether to go forward to the next step or you kill the thing, right? So, showing rigor and then showing value out of that rigor, which would be the learning, the knowledge
Yeah.
that can help inform decision making, right? That's, I would say, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is to design great experiments.
I like that because it challenges that young person to look around to see where the potential of an experiment would be. So
Yeah.
they have to be in a learning mode immediately themselves, regardless of how their boss is treating them.
Absolutely. And again, I go back to these 3 criteria that seem to guide a lot of what I do, which is desirability, feasibility, and viability, right? And a lot of people are focused only on viability, maybe some on desirability, depending on where you sit. So there's desire for my idea, there's desire for my product, there's desire for this service. I could do a bunch of experiments, I could gather competitive intelligence, I could test the markets, I could do all sorts of things to learn about desirability. I could do all sorts of things to learn about feasibility. Can we actually build this thing? Is it feasible? And and where I see a lot of people fall down is on viability. Like, I've got this great idea. I know I can build it. I'm pretty sure somebody wants it more than somebody. Lots of people want it, right? But what is it going to require in the ecosystem to thrive? And a lot of people don't experiment in this space. So another thing maybe to think about for folks who are working with a manager is, find the places where you're not getting the best data, like viability in many cases, and show up there into that space, show up with something valuable that you've learned through an experiment, and say, hey, this is I learned this because I took an experiment approach, or I learned this because I did some scrappy prototypes and saw that the real issue was this. That's what was getting in our way, right?
Oh, you just said something that helped me. You said you already had done it, which means that the experiment that they create has to be one that they can control themselves and build themselves, so they can do it. And then so that when they're going to their boss, they're not going, can I do this experiment? They're going to say, I tried this and this is the value that I learned.
Well, that's the beauty of the intersection of iteration and experimentation, right? If I start with something scrappy that doesn't require a lot of investment of resources, I'm probably in an arena with more degrees of freedom than if it was bigger and I had to ask for even $5,000 if I have to ask for it, right? But if I do something super scrappy, like make a big cardboard phone and talk out of the hole and to my colleagues and see what they think, what resonates. That doesn't cost anything, right? But it does get to another point, though, that I wanted to share about this situation of a manager or boss that doesn't support it or might be skeptical. And that's around negotiating areas where I might have more degrees of freedom. And I think this is a conversation that most people just don't even think to have. Where is it critical for you that we deliver, we execute, as with certainty and scalability and control and excellence? And where are the places where I could experiment? And that conversation can really help ease the manager's fear that this creativity or this experimentation is going to mean 1,000 flowers blooming everywhere and a decrease in delivery of our core business, right?
Got it. Stephen, I think you're going to have to come back and talk more about that, because I think that's critical, especially for young people. They're not trained in that kind of thinking. At least that's not my experience. And I work with a lot of young people. So
I think maybe naturally they're more oriented towards experimentation than we might.
Of course they are.
But maybe that this rigor, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is something to be.
Yeah. I wasn't clear about that. That's what I meant. Yeah. They don't know the rigor in order to be able to present, as you say, and negotiate what's going to happen.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we've already decided you're coming back.
Oh, I'd love to.
Good. Thank you so much for today. I knew it would be a joy, and it was indeed. Thank you so much. And is there anything final words that you want to say?
I just encourage people to think about what an experimental mindset would mean for our lives. Mm-hmm. We talked about it in terms of achieving and doing and all that. What would an experimental mindset mean at home with our family?
Yeah.
When we follow our curiosity? So there are places that we haven't touched on as much here, but I just encourage an experimental mindset. I'm often finding myself still trying to improve. So, it's a process of learning.
Excellent point. Stephen Kowalski, thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Every now and then, there is something that changes how I think about the world. Grounds for Thought is a place where I talk about these moments so that you can explore the meaning for yourself. Several times, I've talked about a lesson from a book by Aaron Betsky and Gideon Fink Shapiro called 50 Lessons to Learn from Frank Lloyd Wright. Today, I'm going to talk about lesson 38, well inside the book. It's called Make Concrete Beautiful. Now, you're probably thinking, what? How can concrete be made beautiful? Well, let's see. Frank Lloyd Wright did a lot of experimentation. He experimented with different ways of organizing the space in a building. He experimented with different construction techniques. He even experimented with different ways to lay a roof. Some were successful, some were not. But when it came to design, Wright was always successful. This lesson came from his willingness and desire to make concrete, which he used in his construction. And he wanted to make it beautiful. The book says he then proposed that each block have a built-in pattern whose geometry, when repeated throughout the building, would create a rhythmic texture across the whole composition, unquote. It was remarkable how a simple iteration of an idea turned what would normally be a very heavy feeling in a building suddenly become extremely attractive. To help you understand this, imagine the Eiffel Tower. Each corner made of iron, rising with curlicues, slowly bending toward the top and even diminishing in width at the top. Now imagine an edifice made of concrete. Imagine an elevated highway. Oh, the road itself may twist in lovely curves, but beneath them are solid, wide, plain, heavy columns of concrete, fully true to their function and truly functional, beauty not being a part of their purpose. Wright used concrete in a lot of his construction, and when looking at his designs, you would never describe them as solid, wide, plain, or heavy. He achieved a very different feel through repetition of a small iteration of his experiment. I'm going to show you 3 examples which come right from the same book, and you can see them how the repetition gives you a sense of real beauty. The first is with these enormous columns of concrete that become almost alive through that little iteration of the same pattern repeated again and again. The second is one constructed of wood. A very large wall of paneled glass windows take on a new feeling when you see the pattern repeated across the top. The last example is extraordinary. What would ordinarily be a very heavy, dense, unwelcoming kind of building is transformed because of a simple touch of repeating a pattern. It is turned into a welcoming place, almost like a birthday cake. I am always in awe of how Frank Lloyd Wright took one idea and through experimenting with it, through iterating it, through repeating it, he was able to create such beauty. You're probably thinking, but I don't build buildings, let alone design them. I simply have a team that has to accomplish a mission. When was the last time you asked your staff, what's a little change we can make that will make our work better, more effective, more efficient, more pleasing to our customers? I once asked my staff that very question. Being in a building separate from the main complex, we were always trying to get staff to visit us so that they could better get service from us. One of my staff members, a librarian, said, "Oh, why don't we have Friday afternoon coffee and donuts in the library? That'll bring our customers, not because they're having problems, but because they want to learn something and get a donut." We had a technical library open to the staff anytime they wanted to come, but that small iteration that said come and have coffee and donuts on a predictable basis increased the number of people who used both the library and, because they were in proximity, our other services as well, and did so dramatically. How can you make something as dull as concrete in an elemental form, never shiny, heavy looking, even uncomfortable to touch, and yet how can you make it beautiful? Something that you want to look at, something that you feel comfortable with. Wright did it with a simple to understand iteration, just one of 50 lessons from Frank Lloyd Wright. Where can you use a change? Thank you for joining me today. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. I love interacting with you, hearing what you are thinking about or concerned with, the topics you'd like me to explore here on Unlocked. The easiest way is to click on a link to a short form that lets you give me your thinking. To find that link, get on my mailing list by registering on the contact page of my website, madelynblair.com. And by the way, I never share my mailing list with anyone, and I send out no more than one email a week. And if you're on YouTube, please click the like button and subscribe. This helps me, certainly, but it also helps others who are looking for similar information. I'm Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilient leader.